Hello. Hopefully you can all hear me. Welcome to not the Lenham Lecture. I'm Steve Clarkson from Kent Beekeepers. If our various attendees could please try and keep yourselves muted where possible, I will attempt to keep you muted as well. While our speakers are presenting. There'll be time for you to ask questions at the end of each talk, if you'd like. First of all, we have a talk on the changing seasons from Professor Tim Sparks, who we've already tested and we appear to be working, or at least we were 5 minutes ago. Anything could have changed in the intervening time, so please bear with us. But I will hand over to Tim now, if that's okay, Tim.
Okay, thank you. I will attempt to share my screen, and if you could just confirm that that's visible. Yeah, it's not visible to me. That's Okay, so I've got some horrible feedback because I think I'm running two Zooms at the same time. What I'm going to do. Sorry, I went muted as well. What I'm going to do is talk about the changing of the seasons, and particularly some work I do with the Woodland Trust on a scheme called Nature's Calendar. So the first slide here shows a picture of dandelion in flower in January, which is one of the reasons that we don't include this in our recording scheme, because it seems to be capable of flowering in every month of the year. Now, there are some changes that have been happening to our environment, which are really quite extraordinary. And so one of these is the general decline in insect abundance. And this slide shows a study that's been done in nature reserves in Germany, where they simply weighed the amount of insects caught each day. And there's been a general decline, even in nature reserves where you'd expect them to be more protected. And this is an example of a very well-run scheme running to a strict protocol. And these results are very important and received a huge amount of publicity a couple of years ago when they were published. But there are some evidence of anecdotal change, and some of the work that I've done involved the Reverend Leonard Jennings, who was the man first selected to be the botanist or the scientist on the beagle, and he turned it down and recommended Charles Darwin went in his place. And these are some of the comments he made about the wildlife of Cambridgeshire, which is where I live, about 180 years ago. And he referred to these three species. The red squirrel, he said, was common, and it went extinct in this county, in Cambridgeshire, in the 1960s. And I've never seen one in this county. But that long ago, it was such a common species that a bounty was being paid to small boys to collect their tails to stop damage to woodland. Well, collect their tails, but of course the squirrel was killed as well. The swallowtail butterfly was described as found in the greatest plenty, and that now only exists in a few locations in Norfolk. And the burbot, which is a freshwater relative of the cod, was also described as common, and that went extinct nationally in 1969. So our environment has changed enormously over the last couple of centuries. Sometimes we have anecdotal evidence, sometimes we have descriptions, sometimes we have well-recorded data that can demonstrate this. When I was at primary school, I had to learn this poem, November, which includes the lines towards the end there. No shade, no shine, no butterflies, no bees, no fruits, no flowers, no leaves, no birds, November. And this was a description of November in the first half of the 19th century, and it has some resonance with how I remember November when I was growing up in the 1960s as quite a miserable month. If we compare the temperatures recorded in a 30-year period when Thomas Hood wrote that poem, we have the box plot on the left, and the blue box there represents the middle 50% of the temperatures that were recorded during that period. So we generally had temperatures between 5 and 7 degrees. However, in the more recent 30 years, and I'm sorry I didn't update this to include 2020, you can see that there's been a shift upwards in temperature, and it now ranges from about 6.5 to about 8 degrees as that core climate. If we look at some long-term temperature records, and it doesn't really matter where we take them from in the UK or worldwide, we can see some big changes in temperature. And the blue line here shows the underlying trend. And you can see there's a rapid rise. It may even be that there is a step-like change from about the 1980s onwards. So we've gone from one climate almost to one that's much warmer over the last 30 or 40 years. So remember this step change, because I'll refer to this again. Now, this is some work in progress. The Wildflower Society run a first week hunt in the first week of March. And each year, recorders go out and they record all the species in the wild that are in flower at that beginning of March. And these are the numbers that have been recorded since the 1920s, right up until last year. And you can see that the numbers vary enormously from about 10 to about 70. And that's enormous variation. We can see the very cold years. This year, which I hope you can see my pointer, is 1963, which is exceptionally cold. 1947 was exceptionally cold. And 2018 was the year of the beast from the east, which probably prevented flowering and also probably prevented people from going out recording. Generally speaking, there's been an upward turn in the number of species recorded, and possibly even a step-like change from sometime in the 1980s onwards. So in more recent time, it's probably been more typical to have perhaps 40 to 50 species in flower in that first week of March. If we plot those data against the winter temperature, we can see there's a very clear pattern. The point on the extreme left here is 1963, this very cold year, very cold spring. And you can see that as temperatures increase, the number of plants in flower recorded in early March increases also. Now, I have some reservations because I believe the early part of the scheme involved recording on just a single day rather than over a whole week. So this next slide also looks at it, and I've broken it up into 3 time periods. Up until 1958 as the open circle, from then till 1987, and from 1988 onwards. And even if we disregard the data from the period up to 1958, you can see there's still this very clear relationship with temperature, quite astonishing response to temperature. Now, we're quite lucky in this country that we have this fascination with weather and what that weather affects. And we're probably laughed about throughout the rest of Europe as our focus on the weather. And a week or two ago, I happened to be watching The Importance of Being Earnest again. And I was quite amused with one of the comments, which I'd either forgotten about or hadn't spotted on previous watchings of the film, which is when Cecily, in her diary, says, "Today I broke off my engagement," and then just casually mentions, "The weather still continues charming." And this is a lovely parody of the way that we discuss the weather, that it enters into a lot of our conversations. And you may think this is comic, but it's been very evident in some of the records that we've been looking at. So this is a diary entry kept by a vicar who recorded for 58 years on every single day the birds that he saw. So from those records, we can get a good idea about when migrant birds first reappeared and so on. And this is at the beginning of 1939, 3rd of September, and he writes, "Magpie, jay, nuthatch, hedge sparrow, wood pigeon, pheasant." He saw 6 bird species. He then just happens to mention that Britain and Germany were at war from 11 a.m. and at the very bottom, rain and thunder in early morning. So there's an emphasis here on bird observations, a passing reference to the beginning of the Second World War, and then a comment about the weather. And it's records like this that have been kept consistently over a long period of time that are very useful to us. One such record is this record of beekeeping from Rutland. And I forget now who the recorder was, but you can see on the left-hand page the dates on which supers were added to his hives. And they varied any time between May and July. On the right-hand page, we have 3 columns, essentially. The date of the first crocus flowering, which could have been January, February, or March. White clover, first flowering, all dates in June, and the yield of honey. And it's quite typical that plants that flower early in the year are much more variable, such as crocus here, than plants which flower later, such as white clover. And whilst we wouldn't expect any major change in this period from 1941 to 1969, we can look at those data to see what the effect of the weather of those years was. So firstly, this is the date on which supers were added against the mean temperature for February, March, and April. And you can see, I hope, that there's quite a clear relationship here, that in those years with warmer temperatures, the supers were added much earlier. That same sort of relationship is also apparent for the first flowering of crocus when plotted against January temperature. And interestingly, again, that extreme point on the top left, very cold, very late, is 1963. For white clover, which has a very much restricted flowering period of about 3 weeks, we can still pick up a relationship with temperature. Again, warmer temperatures, early flowering. And if we look at those yield records, the yield of honey, we can see strong influences of temperatures in April, July, and August. Now, I'm not quite sure, because I'm not a beekeeper, whether there's something important about those 3 months, or whether it's just because these are the records from a single recorder and we'd need a lot more data to draw conclusions. I'm very lucky to be able to do quite a lot of collaborative work with colleagues in Poland. And this is the date of the first cleansing flight of honeybee recorded in Poznan, which is in Western Poland. And from about 1985 onwards, there has been an advance in the dates of the first cleansing flight. Again, there's possibility that there's a step-like change sometime in the 1980s. So the late years tend to be at the beginning, and then there's possibly a step change. But overall, there's been a decline, an advance in the date of the first cleansing flight. This is another Polish set of data, but this time from Wrocław, further south than Poznan. And this time we have a slightly longer record. And this beekeeper recorded, for example, the number of harvests of honey that he took. And in the early years, you can see there was generally 2 or 3. But in more recent years, the number of harvests has increased to 4. And likewise, the annual yield of honey per hive has increased, and possibly even a step-like change from maybe 1990 onwards. But let's return to the UK for a while, and we'll talk about some characters that have been involved with recording phenology, which is the study of the timing of events, particularly in relation to the weather. And one of my early heroes is this character, Robert Marsham, M-A-R-S-H-A-M, not Martian. He was born in 1708, and from 1736, he started recording his indications of spring, which were the flowering times of 4 species, the leafing times of 13 trees, and then some events relating to migrant birds and frogs and so on. And he was obsessed with trees, and he planted possibly millions of them around his estate just north of Norwich. And the important thing is that his records, which he started in 1736, were continued by subsequent members of his family right down until at least 1958. If we look at just the records that the first Robert Marsham recorded, because his son was Robert Marsham and his grandson was Robert Marsham, so disentangling who was who is sometimes difficult. And these show the relationships between his oak leafing dates against spring temperature. And you can see that there's this really strong relationship, much earlier leafing in those warm springs. And the relationship here is about 8 days earlier for every 1 degree warmer. And that's quite an impressive relationship. One of my more recent heroes is Jean Coombs, who was here shown receiving her OBE. She has been recording the leafing dates of trees since 1947. And if we look at her oak budburst dates in this case, we can see that she started this particular tree in 1950 and has been continuing to record it ever since. The red line here is the underlying trend, and it's now about 3 weeks earlier than it was when she started to record. And again, is there evidence of a step-like change in the 1980s, with everything since then being so much earlier? I'll just give you some examples of some other types of records that we have. This is a card index system that Anne Hall kept near Newcastle for about 50 years, and she recorded the flowering dates of the 200 plant species she could identify. And that's a really useful long-term record from the northeast of England. Not everyone records on paper. I think these records are Alan Chester's, I think, from Warwickshire, recorded of daffodil flowering dates and painted on his shed door, or on his shed. And elsewhere, there are some really impressive long-term records. So this is from Geneva, the first bud burst of horse chestnut from 1808 onwards. So we got over 200 years of this data, and the red line again shows the underlying trend, and you can see how much earlier it is now than it was previously. If we had to give a prize for the longest record, it would have to go to the Japanese. So Kyoto is the former capital of Japan, and cherry festivals are incredibly important to Japanese culture. And so their dates have been recorded since the year 705. And from about the time of the Norman conquest, there have been enough records to look at the underlying trend. And you can pick out years when volcanic eruptions clouded the sky and springs were very late. But the important thing is the change that we've seen in the last 30 years or so, and with a much advanced flowering dates for cherry. I'm going to skip the next slide because I'm very conscious that I've left too many slides in this presentation. And just to return to Leonard Jennings again, this was the vicar that didn't go on the Beagle and chose Darwin to go in his place. And he made the very astute point that it's very easy to watch plants, to record plants, to see when they flower in the spring, when they come into leaf. But birds and insects are a bit more difficult because you're never quite sure where they're going to be. And I'll just share with you this cartoon. And there is argument about what does the first record tell us and how reliable it is. And to be frank, probably the first record isn't very reliable. But when you gather together a large group of people that are all recording, then it becomes much more robust. And as an example of that, I'd like to show you 4 records of the first sighting of the male orange-tip butterfly. These are 4 people who never knew one another, were not part of a scheme, just recorded for their own amusement, if you like. We have Richard Harrington, who used to be in charge of the insect survey at Rothamsted Experimental Station in Hertfordshire. And he would go out running at lunch times and record the orange tip when he encountered it. Anne Phillips in Walsall, I believe, largely recorded in her garden. John Clark was a farmer at Burwell in Cambridgeshire. And Owen Tudor, great name, recorded a butterfly transect in the Wyre Forest towards the Welsh border. And what is important here is the degree of agreement between these 4 recorders in the dates of the first orange tip and how far it has advanced in that period. Sorry, I've cheated a little bit here. This axis, the y-axis, is the date of the year. So 121 is May the 1st, 152 is June the 1st. And we can get some other information where we know now that London has an undue influence on its own climate and the way that plants react within it. So within 30 kilometers of the center of London, horse chestnuts flower very much earlier than they do when you go further away from the center of London. And it doesn't matter whether you're going south or north, the horse chestnuts in central London are still earlier. So we have lots of information about plants flowering earlier from a wide range of locations. And generally speaking, most of them are getting earlier. There are a few problem species. Coltsfoot is actually one of my bête noirs, I suppose, because it should be getting earlier. Everything points to it getting earlier, but the only 2 long-term records that we seem to have both show it getting later. And that's a bit of a mystery. I believe it's something to do with increased rarity, but it's not certain at the moment. The jury's still out on that one. Other records, which are not necessarily biological, but are still very interesting and concern the seasons, is from Alaska in this case, where since 1917, they've been dragging out a wooden tripod onto a frozen river, attaching it by a wire to a clock, and the clock stops when the wooden tripod falls through the ice and pulls the pin out. You now bet $1 or $2. You specify a day and a time, and the people that are closest to the time, which was 12:56 on the 27th of April last year, share the jackpot, which last year was $125,000. But this has provided a record of more than a century of melt dates on this river. The red line here is the underlying trend, again, showing it's been getting very much earlier. And there is a lesson to be considered from this particular slide. Here we're using records, all records since they began. If we wanted to emphasize warming, we would start on a particularly late year and end on a particular early year. And if we wanted to emphasize lack of an effect, we'd do the reverse. So it's very important that we try and use as much data as we have and not be selective in the years that we include. I spend a lot of time analyzing other people's data, and my own contribution to recording phenology is quite modest. And part of that involves our family's first rhubarb crumble. So here I have the dates of our first rhubarb crumble plotted against February temperature, and there is a relationship there. It's not brilliant. Most of these dates tend to be Sundays, so we're only accurate to a week, and there's no scientific way of estimating there's enough rhubarb crumble. It's just a very subjective opinion of there is enough rhubarb for a crumble or there isn't. And we can see here, 2018, the year of the beast from the east, was one of the later ones, and 2011 and 2020 down here on the right-hand side, and they are particularly early. So 2018, cold and late. 2011, 2020, warm and early. It's also possible to get impression of change from other sources of information, and those include photographs. So John Wills was an amateur meteorologist in Norwich, part of the Coleman family, interestingly enough. And for 30 years, he recorded photographs on the 1st of January, 1st of February, 1st of March, 1st of April, and 1st of May. And he published in a wonderful little book in, I think, 1944 called Weatherwise. And these photographs are included. And you can see here on the left, February the 1st, 1916, with emergence of daffodils, and 1917, snow on the ground and no sign of the daffodils. These are my own photographs from Cambridge, and they show the same avenue of trees, limes and horse chestnuts, recorded at the beginning of April. And you can see that there are some remarkably early years. 2011, 2020 wasn't bad either. 2018 was the beast from the year and was really quite cold and miserable. And I also take photographs at the end of the year. So these are photographs of oak trees roughly at the end of November, beginning of December. And you can see some years when they're completely bare and some years when they still look quite green. but no obvious pattern over this 20-year period. And this fixed date photography can sometimes work. It is a very long-term commitment, and it doesn't always work. So these are some photographs that I was taking every 2 weeks, just a selection of them. And the last photograph shows you what happened to the tree that I was photographing. So you can't always predict what will happen in the future and whether your subject will still be there to record. Sadly, this has happened to me several times. Trees that I've been photographing have been cut down. But photographic images are very powerful. They show huge changes in glaciers, for example. And closer to home, we can think about sources of information which are recorded every year on the same date, or roughly on the same date. So here at the cenotaph, we can generally get photographs on either November the 11th or the second Sunday of every month from 1919 onwards. And the trees in the background on the left-hand picture are London plains, and they're the same on the right-hand picture, which is the same day of the year. And you can see huge difference between the skeletal trees on the left and the ones which are still fairly well leafed on the right. And we can repeat this exercise, for example, in Paris, where there are photographs taken on November the 11th each year along the Champs-Élysées. And if we generally look at this over time, we can see that there have been years recently with much more leaves than there were back in the 1920s and 30s. Another source of information would be CCTV. So this essentially are a series of photographs taken from Harvard Forest in New England. And these now stretch back quite a few years. Other sources of information include, for example, herbarium specimens, which often have the dates on which the specimen was recorded. Insect specimens, so the fly on the right is from the Natural History Museum and includes a date of when it was caught. So there's lots of historic data present. There's also published sources, or there would be, yeah, there you are. Sorry, I did manage to advance the slide. So these are dates of lime trees in the Bank of England from 1888 to 1902. And a lot of this information is just sitting there waiting to be discovered. It's not always in a printed form. Some of it is still handwritten and quite difficult to interpret. And we still get more sources of data. So fly fishermen are very keen to know when mayfly and other aquatic flies emerge because they want to know when they change the artificial flies for the fly fishing. And we have and are waiting to process over 100 years worth of data on fly fishing. Other events involve more human decision on when they occur. And one of those is the Flower Festival at Triplow in Cambridgeshire. It's been held every year since 1969 with 3 exceptions. A foot and mouth year, last year, and sadly this coming year, and there will be no festival. And if we look at those dates, here only up to 2018, you can see the way that the festival has been gradually brought forward as the organisers have had to respond to a much earlier flowering. I want to briefly tell you about Nature's Calendar, the UK Phenology Network, because I'd like to get as many of you involved in recording as possible, if you're not already. It's coordinated by the Woodland Trust, who I think are doing a very good job of this. It was revived just over 20 years ago and has now reached a stage of maturity that it's becoming really very useful. There are schemes for recording events in spring and autumn. The events are tried to be kept to be simple, and there's online recording, although the Woodland Trust website has had a few problems in recent weeks and months. And also, there's a scheme there to add older records to the database. And the database now consists of more than 3 million records. And the web address is there. So you can choose to record as little or as much as you want from these groups of events and species. And as an example for trees, that may include bud burst, first leaf, first flowering, first ripe flute, tinting in autumn, and leaves falling in autumn. And using the data collected by this army of volunteers, we can show that there has been a general change in spring. It has advanced in more recent years, and it's now about 8 days earlier in general than it was from the years 1891 through to 1947. And records go onto the database and they can be mapped instantly. And these maps can be, there's a slider so you can see how records change through Britain. And all of this is either available now or will be as soon as the Woodland Trust website recovers. And as an example of the maturity and the level of value of this is one of our recorders, Martin Baker, who's been with us really from the beginning. And these show his horse chestnut flowering dates each year plotted against spring temperature. And that's an astonishingly good relationship. The data also allow us to get into the debate about how we measure the start and the end of the growing season. So the Met Office has its own rules, and they are to do with temperatures above 5 degrees Celsius, which is thought to be the temperature which is necessary for plant growth. So here we have a couple of years, 2012, an early year, 2013, a late year, and the red bars are temperatures above 5 degrees and the blue below 5 degrees. And the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different measures of the start of the growing season vary from January the 1st to the middle of March in that first year. And we have 4 possible measures at the end of the growing season, and they vary by about a month as well. So there's still dispute about how we measure the beginning and the end of the growing season, and how long the growing season is in between, and what happens if things come into growth and then are halted by a cold snap. And hopefully in the future, we can use a lot more phenological data to help disentangle this. So I am conscious of the time, and this is my hopefully final slide. So phenology, which is the study of the timing of events, has a very long history. It goes back 300 years in the UK, goes back even further in some other countries. We've seen lots of change, particularly in spring, and we've seen advances in flowering dates and leafing dates, insect activity, frog spawning, bird migration, and a whole range of other events. And we're currently relying very heavily on our volunteer recorders, and we've now got enough years of data that we can make a real contribution to scientific research. And what is now ideal is that we continue that monitoring in order to identify changes and look at where there may be issues. So for example, with life cycles, particularly with species that rely heavily on one another. So for butterflies, there are some species whose caterpillars only feed on one plant species. And if those two don't remain in synchrony, then there could be potential problems in the future. So I'll finish my talk there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Sparks. Hopefully everyone found that very interesting. Does anyone have any questions? Would be the first thing. You should be able to unmute yourself and shout over me.
Yes. Hello. I have Alan English, Dartford BKA. I have a question. Most of your information was about showing that over the years we've had a general warming, which we know about. Can you tell us anything about variability? Has that changed? Are we getting greater variation from one year to the next, or lesser variation? Or can you not make any deduction about that?
In terms of temperature?
Yes.
No, we're not really getting a huge amount of variation in monthly temperatures, but what we seem to be getting more recently are more extreme events. So they're recorded lower than the monthly means. So we get very hot days or very wet weather, and those extremes seem to be becoming more common.
Okay, thank you.
One thing that I didn't mention was we had a wonderful recorder on Guernsey who recorded flowering every week of the year, and what his data seemed to show was that in warmer years, plant flowering periods got shorter, which I guess would be of concern for beekeepers if a particularly important plant species was flowering for a shorter period in the year.
Okay. Thank you.
We've had a question on the chat from Julie Coleman, who has asked, you mentioned there was a step change in the 1980s. Can you attribute that to anything in particular?
I think that one's beyond my pay grade. Obviously the change that's been happening has been largely driven by greenhouse gases, of which CO2 are one. And this step change has been observed in a whole range of sort of biological events right around the world. And the problem is we probably won't know for another 20 years whether or not there was a step change, because we really need enough data to actually determine whether that's real or just part of a trend. I hope you're not all experiencing the horrible echo that I'm getting.
I don't think so. I muted one of your devices.
I've got a question, and that is, although you've been telling us about wildflowers and the difference and the dates of their first flowering, has any notice been taken of the growth on farms like oilseed rapes, yes, and other crops? Have you got any dates on those, or don't you use those?
We don't use them as part of this scheme, but I used to work in agriculture at the time when oilseed rape was starting to be used as a commercial crop. And it's very evident that the crop is now flowering considerably earlier than it was then. I don't have any records of that, but there should be organizations that do. But I think it's so clear that oilseed rape is flowering much earlier that it's probably unnecessary. The other aspect of this is that oilseed rape now has a huge acreage and is a much more important resource for bees than it ever was back in the 1970s when it was really getting going.
Thanks.
Pleasure.
Are there any questions from anyone else?
Steve, Bob Chapman.
You
Can I
can't
speak
see-
up?
You can.
Tim, Nature's Calendar, have the volunteers gone up over the years? Is it, to what extent has the number of recordings shot up? I won't ask whether those figures relate to any particular temperature, but I just wondered how as an organisation it was thriving over the years.
We have ups and downs. So we've had years when we've been featured on the Springwatch programme on BBC, and we get a huge peak in recording. But it's difficult to keep those people for subsequent years. The numbers have been falling. Our recorders tend to be at the top end of the age spectrum. And I think this is common with a lot of recording schemes. The lockdown last year didn't help us very much. I'm quite surprised because I thought with more people at home, we might have had more records. But it seems that that wasn't the case. We tried to take the opportunity to get people involved because a lot of this recording can be done in your own garden. And it would be a great scheme for lockdown, I think, and particularly for dog walkers who are so bored of walking the same route day after day after day. And if you can monitor the oak trees and the horse chestnuts at the same time, it makes it so much more fun.
There's been another question on the chat from Veronica Owen, who asks, it seems very early for me. I have already seen daffodils. No, in fact, I lie. There was another one before that. Sorry, I'll do that one in a minute. Have you looked at Horticultural Society records, or do you not record plants grown in gardens?
The scheme would include species grown in the garden. So if you have tree species in your garden, that's great. We originally had primrose in the scheme, but the data became so contaminated with people recording garden polyanthus that we just had to abandon it. There are species that you can record in your garden. First snowdrop, lesser celandine, wood anemone if you're lucky enough to have it. Bluebells we would restrict to the English bluebell, so probably not a garden plant for most of us. Depends how big our garden is. But there are species there that you can record, and the insects, of course, you can record. I get orange tips and holly blue butterflies in my garden, and obviously some of the migrant birds. So there is an opportunity to do quite a bit of that recording in your own gardens. Not all, but a sizable proportion.
Thank you. And reading again the comment, I've half read once from Veronica Owen, which has now disappeared off my screen. It seems very early for me. I have already seen daffodil flowers in full bloom, and I have seen lambs 4 days ago. Is this normal?
Lambs.
Answer that.
I've seen it too.
Yeah, lambs depend on when you put your ram on your ewes. And it's less natural now than it probably has been for a long time. So farmers are trying to take advantage of an early market and are tending to produce lambs earlier. But it's a decision by the farmer on when he brings the rams in rather than a natural process. Oh, sorry. No, I think that's fair. Daffodils. Yes, we've had years with daffodils at Christmas. And we've had years with frog spawning in December. So we do get some unusual events. With daffodils, we need to be very careful because there's something like 600 different varieties, and some of them are designed to be very early flowers. I saw some today. I went out for a cycle ride during lockdown this morning, and I noticed them in a big garden in a nearby village.
One from Catherine Handy. Does the London effect apply to flowers and insects or just trees?
We've only looked at it for horse chestnut, to be quite frank, but I imagine that if it displays an effect on horse chestnut, it will display an effect on insects and a lot of other flowers as well.
And I think probably a final one from Andrew Charlie. Not sure if Tim can answer this. Perhaps others might be able to answer. Has the advance in first day of spring caused a greater damage caused by infecting virus and parasite attacks on bees?
No, you're quite right. I won't be able to answer that one. Sorry, I'm not a beekeeper. I do work, particularly in Poland, with people with long-term records. And I have got some interesting data on winter losses, which is waiting to be processed. But I don't know anything about viruses and so on. Sorry.
Okay. If there's no other questions from anyone? Doesn't like it. Thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you.
That was excellent. There's silent clapping going on everywhere. Very exciting. Okay, we're going to stop for pause for a tea break / anything else you might need to do for 15 minutes, just over. So if we rejoin at 3:15, we will have a talk from Mark Ballard on removing bees from difficult places. I hope to see you all then. 15 minutes. Thank you.
How are you, Mark?
I'm very well. Who's that?
David Wood.
Hello, David. How are you going?
Oh, okay, thanks. Yeah, I have trouble with Zoom, and I've only just managed to join the meeting, having caught up with some of it on YouTube.
All
I
right.
guess I'm now on Zoom.
Yes, it's I don't know much about beekeeping, but I know even less about IT.
Yeah, well, I'm glad I've made able to join to hear your escapes and.
Yeah, I may be guilty of the same mistake that Tim made with too many slides, but we'll see. How was your
Hello,
self
Mark.
anyway?
Mark, are you still building as well?
Not if I can help it.
But you still got the bees?
Yes. Yeah, I've done nothing over the past 12 months construction wise at all, and very
Right.
little in collecting bees.
Yeah. Have you still got your wild flowers though? Your meadow up there?
I haven't actually. It's the first 2 years were absolutely fantastic.
I know, I saw it.
And then who's that am I talking to?
It's Ray Copeland from Medway.
Oh, Ray. Oh yeah, I can see your mark down the bottom. I couldn't see your face.
I know, I'm being a bit, yeah, I should put me on really. Yeah.
The first couple of 3 years were very good. The first year was excellent.
Mm.
But the producer of the flower seed, I got them from the Jaegers they were at Linton, but now they've moved to Oldcombe.
Okay.
They don't do that particular flower mix anymore.
Right.
And it was superb. I tried a couple of others, but not really very good.
It looks incredible.
But yeah, we got a lot of enjoyment out of that first couple of years. It really was spectacular.
Yeah, I know it was. Have you been over to Sutton Valence? Did you do any swarm collection from there last year?
No, I've done nothing at all. As far as I can remember, I've only done about 4 or 5.
Yeah, I remember one of the was the Belfry, wasn't it? Wasn't it at was it Barming, somewhere like that? You did church.
I did one at Teeston.
Teeston, yeah, that's the one. Yeah, I remember that one.
I'm trying to think what the name of the place was. It's on one of my slides.
Cool.
That was a particularly difficult and challenging job, that one.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it. It's always a pleasure, Mark. But
yeah, it's I do get some strange places. They'll be in the slides.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, if I can get Zoom working okay,
you'll be fine. It's looking good. You'll be fine.
Oh, okay, thanks.
David? David, are you there?
Oh, that seems to be me a recording.
Oh, right. I just wondered, did you ever own?
So goodness knows what's going on now.
Oh. Can you still hear me?
So what was all that? That was a recording of our previous conversation.
Oh, right. You're back then, David?
I'm back, yes. Having heard myself in the previous conversation.
Oh, did you ever own a 3-wheel car back in the 1950s, 1960s? Are you there, David?
I'm still here.
I was saying, what was your first car you owned? Can you remember?
My first car,
Was it a three-wheeler Bond?
no.
Ah,
No, mine was a Morris Minor, Series 2.
I've got a 1956 three-wheeler, a Bond mini car, and the first owner or the last owner was a David Wood of Sittingbourne.
No, it wasn't me.
Ah.
My car was owned by the son of the Bishop of Rochester. Hello.
Was it blessed?
Sorry?
I say, was it blessed?
Oh, yes, it was a blessed nuisance.
Oh, right.
I don't know how many times I replaced big end bearings on it. I
Really?
learned a lot about cars.
A Friday car.
Yeah, sorry. What was that, Mark?
I said it was a Friday car.
A Friday car?
Yeah.
Yeah, quite likely. Now, oh dear, here we go again. It's Leslie asleep there. No, oh, she's awake.
I'm doing some work while I'm listening to you two rabbiting on.
We're trying to stop people getting bored.
I don't know whether you'd make much as a cabaret between you.
We're too old for that, Leslie.
The cat's come up and seen me and walked right across the desk and back. I wonder if you've seen his tail.
Nice to see you, Leslie.
How are you?
I'm fine. Well vaccinated.
Yeah, you feel that's a step in the right direction?
Perhaps my next question will be, how many of the audience have been vaccinated?
I was just thinking the same. Yeah, we've had ours.
Hello, David.
Some of them are just youngsters.
What?
I feel we're in the minority.
Mind your fingers with that saw.
Well, if the suppliers could provide it with the right blooming length, it would be all right.
Is that a brood box being made up or a chair?
Brew box. I'm quite fortunate being the younger tech savvy that I'm able to get you up on my phone while practically putting bits together. I only got about another 10 more hives to go.
Keep you busy this afternoon.
Indeed, indeed. Well, to be honest, I'm quite looking forward to this one, actually. My summer hobby seems to be catching swarms. Everyone keeps asking me, that's not known to beekeeping, what kind of net do you use?
I have a little hat and a pipe, and they follow me.
I should try that one out this year.
Hello, and welcome back.
Hi, Steve.
Let me get myself sorted. Okay, right. Okay, so our second talk this afternoon is from Mark Ballard on catching or removing swarms from more interesting places. I will hand over to him. Thank you.
Let's see whether we got this right. Because last time I
yeah, it's looking good.
Sorry?
It's looking good.
Oh, right. Oh, that works. That's good. But I haven't got my... What can you see now? Can you see my text?
Yes.
Now how do I get rid of that?
Back up into display settings and swap them around again. There we go.
Is that better?
Yep.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the world of a bee whisperer. My name is Mark Ballard, and I've been keeping bees for about 20 years after having completed a beginner's course with the late Terry Clare. I soon became addicted to all aspects of beekeeping. Initially, like a lot of other beekeepers, I collected the occasional swarm, but I soon realised that some swarms moved into buildings and that people needed these bees to be removed. That could be within a roof, walls, chimneys, and the occasional bird box. All my working life was spent in construction, and so I started using my construction skills and my knowledge of beekeeping, together with a lot of patience, to remove bees from areas where they were causing a problem. I removed both honeybees. Sorry about that. I've lost my plot. I removed both honeybees and bumblebees and relocate them away from their original sites. I'm trying to get the, oh, that's better. Because the rescued honeybees are in hives, they are relatively easy to relocate, so long as it is more than 3 miles away. I have a quarantine apiary on a local farm where I can put the rescued bees. Bumblebees are a little more difficult to relocate. As they are not in hives, they will need some protection from the weather. If they were nesting in a roof space, I relocate them in or on the roof of one of my sheds. If they're in a compost heap or under the ground, I put them into one of my compost bins and make sure they are protected from the weather. And occasionally people have asked for colonies of bumblebees for their gardens. If the bumblebees are not causing a problem, I try and talk my clients into letting them stay. I explain the life cycle of the bee and that they will disappear later in the year. Fortunately, most people are happy for the bees to stay. Generally, all I need to remove a bumblebee nest is my bee suit with veil, some gloves and Wellingtons, a cardboard box. The 6 bottled cardboard boxes that wine comes in are ideal, and my wife is quite happy to provide me with as many as I want. I also use an old pillowcase, a large torch with a red lens, a large pair of scissors, and a couple of wide bladed scrapers or trowels. As I work alone, I always tell people where I'm working, and I take my mobile phone. Bumblebees are opportunists. They do not take their nesting material in. They make use of whatever is there. It could be an old bird's nest, rat's or mouse's nest, glass fibre roof insulation, an old coat or blanket in the corner of the shed or garage. Indeed, anything lying around. These bees in this slide have made their nest under the glass fibre roof insulation in the roof of a porch, and were attacking the occupants whenever they went in or out. The vibration of opening and closing the front door made the bees investigate. These are the European tree-dwelling bumblebee, Bombus hypnorum. It's probably the most aggressive of all the bumblebees. The slightest noise or vibration can cause them to react and attack. Often I'm asked to remove bumblebees from a roof space where there is no lighting and it is pitch black. This is where the torch with the red lens comes into play. Bees cannot see red light, so it does not disturb them, but bright white light will attract them. Removing a nest of bumblebees.
Sorry, Mark, it looks like you've switched over to your notes view again.
Oh. Is that better?
Yeah, that's got it. Thank you.
Don't know why that happened. Removing a nest of bumblebees. I carefully expose the nest to get an idea of its size. Usually a bumblebee colony has no more than 400 bees, often a lot less. I then slide a wide-bladed scraper or trowel underneath the nest and transfer it into the box. This nest above is in some insulating material and pipe lagging in the roof space. When transferring into the box, care is taken not to turn it over, as the cells contain nectar for the brood. The box is then put into an old pillowcase. Ideally, the box should be put back as close to the original nest as is possible. The box is then left on site until dusk after the bees have stopped flying. However, this can be quite late as bumblebees fly a lot later than honeybees and can often be up to 10:30 or 11 o'clock in the evening. I return at dusk, seal the pillowcase and take the bees away, making as little noise and vibration as possible. If disturbed, it could be another 30 minutes before the bees settle back in the box. This slide shows on the left-hand side, the box being put into the pillowcase and has been put back into its original position. The picture on the right shows how the pillowcase is sealed. Just a matter of drawing the pillowcase together and using an elastic band to keep it tight. Occasionally, I'm asked to remove bees' nests under the ground. It could be Bombus terrestris or Bombus locorum. It is the same procedure. Carefully expose the nest and transfer it into a box. The box is put into a pillowcase and put back to the original position. I usually warn the client to keep children and pests away. The box is left until dusk, sealed and removed and relocated the next day. Occasionally, I'm asked to remove a bumblebee's nest that is underground.
I think you've swapped over again. Sorry.
Oh, is it? I think it must be one of the buttons on the thing that I'm using that does it. Unlike swarms, established honeybee colonies may have both brood and stores to protect, and may therefore be very defensive. Generally, swarms are much easier to remove and take a lot less time than established colonies in buildings. Swarms can be relocated anywhere. However, established colonies need to be moved more than 3 miles away. Otherwise, they will return to their original nest site. To remove a honeybee colony from within inside the building, I may need the following equipment, depending on where the nest is. Possibly some scaffolding, ideally a platform 1.2 meters by 2.4, 4 foot by 8 foot. Because of the amount of equipment I need, I do not work off ladders. I usually need a standard national brood box, the floor, a travelling screen, empty frames, elastic bands, a couple of ratchet straps, at least 4 long ropes, several clean buckets to put honeycomb in, some buckets, sacks or bags to put old comb in. Essential is a bucket of water because everything often gets covered in honey. My box of tools contains a bag of elastic bands, a couple of folding saws, a cut down milk container, which is ideal for getting bees into the brood box if they're on a vertical wall. Several knives to cut the comb with, a couple of scrapers, a very flexible palette knife, and some larger scrapers. I also need a very large smoker because sometimes the bees take several hours to get out of either the wall or the chimney. A fine water spray, which sometimes is better than the smoker to keep the bees quiet. Some J's fluid to sterilise the area once all the bees have been removed. A small demountable table, which is ideal to put the brood box on to get it nearer to where the bees are. Again, because I work alone, I tell my wife where I'm going and make sure I've got my mobile phone with me. Depending on where the bees are located, I may need long-handled tools. A couple of scrapers. One is a right-angled scraper and a straight edge scraper. pole, which is handy when working in a chimney to secure the comb so it doesn't fall down. A hinge board with rope. This I use when I remove bees from chimneys. The hinge board, having removed several combs from the edge of the chimney, the hinge board is lowered down the flue. The flap drops down, thus preventing loose comb falling down the flue, and the board is then secured. This is a typical chimney with a colony of bees in it. The left-hand picture shows the capping has been taken off the top of the chimney, and the right-hand one shows the colony with several of the combs removed. This was the first colony of bees I removed from a chimney. The client was having a wood-burning stove installed and also a flue liner inserted in the flue. The chimney had not been used for many years and had been capped with a concrete slab. A colony of honeybees had found its way in some years ago. Fortunately, the contractors who were fitting the wood-burning stove needed a scaffold to insert the flue liner. This is typical of the scaffold needed to remove bees from a chimney. The long ropes I mentioned earlier I used to haul my equipment up onto the scaffold. It's not possible carrying a national brew box or all the kit up the ladder. It can be very tiring work. Initially, what I do is get to the top of the scaffold, drop the 4 ropes down, make sure they're secured at the top, and then I go back down and secure all my equipment to the ropes. Once the cap had been removed, I was able to assess the size of the colony and what equipment was needed. In the summer months, it's surprising how quickly bees, wasps and hornets find the exposed honey. This is the flue with several combs have been removed to allow the hinge board to be slid down the flue. The nest went down about 1.2 meters. It's about 4 feet in old money. All the comb, brood and honeycomb have been removed. The wax has been scraped off the brickwork and the whole area sterilised. I usually use a dilute film of Jay's fluid. I was called out some years ago to remove a colony of honeybees from a gable end of a bungalow. I noticed that there was indeed a lot of bees flying in and out, but no pollen was going in. It could be an indication of possible robbing. There were also the telltale signs of white powder, and I suspected someone had killed the original colony of bees. My suspicions were confirmed as I got to the bottom of the roof. I asked the client when the wasps had been treated. She said about 10 days ago. She had called a friend who ran a pest control company, and he sent his son out to deal with them. The client wouldn't reveal who the company was. All the honey in that comb had to be destroyed as it was contaminated. This is Leybourne Grange at Alresford, where Taylor Wimpey had bought the Leybourne Grange site for housing development. It included the 2-storey mansion house, which was being converted into luxury flats. I was asked to remove some bees that were stinging the scaffold contractors. The bees were going out behind the board, and I knew that there was a colony of bees inside. All the windows in this building had been boarded up for some years to prevent vandals gaining access. Fortunately, the boards had been fixed with screws, which made removal of it relatively easy. Once I'd removed the board, it revealed an established colony of bees. Removal of these bees was relatively easy as the colony was at waist level. It was just a matter of carefully cutting the comb out to the same dimensions as the empty frames and putting the frames together with the bees into a hive. I usually try and get all the brood, especially the one with the queen on, into the hive first, and that makes it easier to get the rest of the bees out. They like to be where the queen is. This slide shows how the comb is cut to fit a standard broom frame. The comb is held in place with elastic bands. As you can see on the left-hand picture, sometimes the comb comes out in quite long lengths, is then cut to fit the brood frame and held in place with elastic bands. Eventually, the bees connect the comb to the frames and eat away the elastic bands. I've often wondered what happens to the bee that bites through the last bit. This is Barham Court at Teeson. In actual fact, this is only the stable block to the mansion house. As you can see by the size of the stables, the house is quite large. I was approached by the state manager to remove a colony of honeybees from the cupola of the clock bell tower up here. The clock bell tower and the roof was being in the process of refurbished. A scaffold was already partly erected, but the bees were stinging the scaffold contractors, who refused to carry out any more work until the bees had been removed. The scaffold was only at ridge height, not high enough for me to get access to the bees at the top of the roof. I agreed that if the company provided a lightweight tower, I would erect it on the existing scaffold. This was probably the most challenging colony to remove. The pictures you see here are of the bell tower and roof after the refurbishment. This picture was taken early morning before the scaffold tower was erected. Just a few bees entering and leaving through a couple of holes in the fascia board. Once I got the tower up and was able to remove the fascia board, a few more bees appeared. As I said before, this was one of the most challenging colonies I've had to remove. It took me 3 days. There were 2 colonies in the roof, and it took me a further half a day to get all the honey out and clean up the roof area. Although damaging the structure was not a problem, as the bell clock tower was going to be rebuilt, I did not want it to collapse before I'd removed the bees, as I had to cut away a lot of timber to gain access to the bees. As you can see from the picture, it's probably 60 feet above ground level. Unfortunately, I don't suffer from a problem with heights. Once I got most of the bees out, it was then a matter of getting the honeycomb out. Wild honeycomb is extremely fragile and can collapse when handled even gently, especially if it is a very hot day and the wax is soft. Everything gets covered in honey: tools, hands, bee suit, and then me. A couple of buckets of water is essential, either with lids on or a large sponge floating in it. It's surprising how many bees don't know how to swim. This is the bell tower of St Mary's at Barming. Another situation where contractors were being stung. Builders had started the process of renewing the floor to the bell tower, which is just above the scaffold. However, the honeybees were causing a problem, stinging the contractors. The walls are about 700 millimeters thick, and bees had built their nest in one of the ventilation holes. This is a close-up of the colony. As you can see, it's been in residence for some years. Fortunately, I was just able to reach the furthest comb and bees. As you can see below the beeswax, there's evidence of a colony used by birds nesting in it years ago. This is an oast house roof at Chartston. Swarms generally look for a cavity about 4 cubic feet or 40 litres and are not too worried about the shape. This nest was 100 millimetres deep, 350 millimetres wide and 1500 millimetres high. The owner asked me to remove the bees as they were stinging the neighbour's children. As you can see from this roof here, most of the comb and the bees are out. There's just a few stragglers at the top. With a bit of smoke and some Jay's fluid, they won't go back. This is the picture of a eaves loft of a farmhouse in Selwich. A honeybee colony had gained access to the loft, which was next to the airing cupboard. Sensible bees. They were probably hoping that the heating would be turned on during the winter months. However, I removed them before winter came. This removal was particularly difficult as the working space was extremely cramped. I spent nearly all day on my hands and knees. It's a tangle of pipes and comb. All the wax and the comb and the bees removed, put into a national brood box, and this is now ready for the final clean-up. This was the roof at East Farley, slightly more difficult. Bees had made their nest or had gone in on the hip end of a building. You can see the newt box I had next to me. And although it wasn't a very large colony, it did take some time to get out. This colony was in the wall of the stables and the bees were stinging the horses. Having removed the weatherboard, it was a simple job of getting the bees and comb into a brood box. I don't know the history of the comb in this area here, but I suspect either the bees died out through starvation, disease, or by the looks of things, vermin had got in and eaten the stores. This is a bungalow at Kitscoty, just off Bluebell Hill. The bungalow was to have another story built on top and the chimney was going to be demolished. Damage to the brickwork of the chimney was not a problem. As you can see from the dark comb, the colony had been in residence for some years. And at the top on the left-hand picture, there's a situation where probably it got so hot inside the colony that the comb started to collapse. This very often happens in chimneys where there is very little ventilation. This is a chimney at Ottham. It shows a colony in a flue that has a flue liner fitted. The flue liner has a generous gap around the sides. This flue is quite large and there's space between the liner and the flue sides to get my hands in. As you can see, there is plenty of room to get the bees out. This was a listed building, so the brickwork, all the bricks that came off the chimney had to be salvaged and their builder rebuilt it. The bees were got into a brood box, as you can see from the right-hand side.
Need to swap your view around again, sorry.
I think that must happen every time I press a certain button on my toggle. As you can see from the picture, the bees are quite happy to go into the brood box. These bees here are exposing their Nasanov glands and fanning, trying to get all the other bees to come to the brood box. You can even see one there taking pollen in. This is another colony of honeybees that have been treated by pest control. No flying bees, lots of dead bees, presence of white powder. Another case of people either not being able to identify honeybees or just not caring. Very often clients have problem with bees, call in pest control, who kill the bees, but do not remove the wax and the comb. Local bees soon find out that there is an unprotected nest with stores in it and start to rob it. The client thinks the pest control has not got rid of the bees and calls in a beekeeper to sort things out. However, once the stores have been robbed, the bees disappear, but a passing swarm may move into the vacant nest and the cycle starts all over again. As you can see here, no bees whatsoever. It's a colony waiting for a passing swarm to move in. This is a property at Wateringbury. The colony was going into the tile hung. The colony was going into the tile hung wall. But after I'd removed the tiles, battens and felt, I could see they were going through into the building under the first floor. The house had recently been refurbished. The first floor room had been carpeted with a pure white carpet. Fortunately, the room was empty, and so it was just a matter of laying a lot of dust sheets over the carpet. I lifted the carpet where I thought the bees might be and was relieved to find that the floorboards had been taken up in the past. Made my life a little bit easier because I didn't have to cut the floorboards. Then just a matter of just cutting the comb and putting it into a brood box and the honey into buckets. I'll move on from that one. This is Bethany School in Goudhurst. It's the inside of the old pump room to the swimming pool. Honeybees were stinging students, lecturers, and the maintenance staff. It was apparent there was at least one colony of bees within the timber walls. On investigation, there were honeybees in at least two of the panels. I eventually removed 4 colonies from the building, one of which had moved in recently. This was the first panel where I took bees out. There was a colony in here that I hived. This is panel number 2, another colony in here. Again, I hived. There was also evidence of bees in this panel here. And this is the bottom side of it. As you can see, the bees have been in this panel for some time by the colour of the brood, or the colour of the wax, compared with the colour of the wax in panel number 2. All panels cleaned out, ready to sterilise. There was still the 4th colony to take out, which was just above colony 1 and was obviously a new colony. Sorry, I had to leave some of the slides out, but thank you very much for listening. And I'm looking forward to this forthcoming season. Are there any questions?
Yes, hello, Mark.
Yes.
Yes, a couple of questions regarding a couple of methods that you haven't mentioned and whether you have tried them and think they're any good. First one is the use of a bee vacuum. I've made myself a bee vacuum a year or so ago, but I've had limited use of it. But I have found that I've taken bees out of the sides of barns, very similar to one of the ones you showed, and I found it was quite useful because when you take out the comb, you often find, you know, all the bees just fly straight back. Whereas if you actually are able to vacuum them up, obviously they stay out. The other one is a bit more speculative, which is driving bees. You know, the technique you can use by sort of constantly hitting the sides of the hive or the nest over a period and drive them out. Have you had any experience of doing that, and does that work, do you think?
Well, in answer to your first question, I do have a bee vac. It was one I made myself. I have used it on several occasions, but you've still got to get the comb out and clean up the area where the bees were.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, it's been fairly successful. One of the problems you have is that you have to have a decompression chamber on the line sucking the bees in. Otherwise, the bees get into the fan motor.
Of course, yes, yeah.
But what was the other one you were talking? Oh, about driving bees.
Driving the bees.
Yeah, they call it tanging.
Yeah.
And the beekeepers that had skeps in the past used to drive bees from the skep into another skep so that they could remove the honeycomb without killing the bees. But I've never used it.
Yes, if I may say, the only time I've tried it with trying to remove bees was where they had gone into a very tall ornamental amphora. It's a big concrete amphora, and I just couldn't get into them with a tiny hole at the top, and I was actually tanging the sides of the amphora for about an hour, and they didn't come out.
They don't read the same books, do they? With talking about driving bees, I've taken bees out between floors from the outside of a building, and to get the bees closer to me, I use a smoker with a long pipe extension to it, and providing you can get it in past the bees and puff some smoke in, that will gradually drive them out. The alternative method I use is the same thing, but with Jay's fluid, diluted down. If you can get the spray nozzle past the bees and spray it, the bees will come out. They just do not like Jay's fluid. But be careful, because if you spray the bees with Jay's fluid, it will kill them.
Okay.
All the areas where I take bees out, I nearly always sterilise it with Jay's fluid. Sometimes it's not necessary. If they're putting a flue liner in a chimney, then it's not necessary. But to stop the bees reinfesting, I normally drench it with Jay's fluid.
Thank you.
Mark, can I come in now with on a point where to start with, you made the point that you like to go to these various places and you always work on your own.
I do, yes.
Why is that? I would have thought that it's safer, and certainly I always go with a second person, and it makes life easier, and it's also a safety thing if you get really badly stung.
I always go on my own, really, because there's not much room in the areas where I work. Certainly the area in the airing cupboard, it wouldn't have been possible for two people to go. But I just prefer to work on my own.
Do you not think there's a safety thing here, even if someone is outside, to have a second person in the vicinity that is capable of picking up where you are at if you get badly hit by the bees?
I've not met anybody I don't think that I would like to work with.
Okay. I can see pictures of some that I've worked with on the screen now.
No, you can't. You shan't make a comment.
We have a question in the chat from Neil Monroe, who says, when relocating bumblebees, are there any laws which need to be observed? And how far do you need to move the nest from the site being vacated?
I treat bumblebees the same as honeybees. I've never experimented how far away you should move them without them flying back, but it's more convenient that I take them back to my my out apiary or my back garden, rather than find somewhere else to relocate them. I don't think there are, bumblebees have no protection, the same as honeybees. And so I don't think there's any law in moving bumblebees. I only move them if I think it's essential.
Can I have a go at you? I've been 60 years taking bees out of buildings, and the easiest one was demolishing a chimney. It had to be taken down. So we put the scaffold up, and instead of having to, I always take a brick out 4 foot down from the top of the chimney and put a 9x1 board through to catch all the comb I lose. But in this instance, I was able to take the chimney down and leave the comb standing. I started at 10 o'clock and we stopped for lunch at 12 o'clock, and we had all the bees out in the hive and put it down across the garden. I said, well, I shall have to get up after lunch to get the flying bees. Do you know, the whole lot relocated down into the garden, and our lunchtime took from 12 o'clock to 2 o'clock. It
was probably the fact that you got the queen into the hive.
Oh, yes, that's
and the bees were fanning, telling all the other bees to come. Yeah. It was almost like swarm conditions.
Yeah, the worst job was taking 2 colonies out either side of a window. The house is tile hung. This is a bedroom wall, and it had softboard with a plaster skim. So I put a frame up and polythene on the floor. It took me a day to take each colony out, and this was at the end of July, and I've always refused to take bees out of a building after the middle of May. Beginning of March to the middle of May. Anyway, this was July. The people had woken up in the morning. They were listening to the bees buzzing. The chap put his finger through the plaster skim because the bees don't like softboard. Anything soft, they get rid of. So there was barely a 16th of an inch plaster. They both abandoned the bedroom at 6 o'clock in the morning. And they rang me up and I said, no, I'm not going to do it now. You'll have to wait. I went into the house during the day and sealed up the wall. I said, you'll have to wait till next spring and I'll take them out. And you know, the people kept ringing me up. So in the end, I went and got them. This was right on the end of July. It took me a day per colony and I got 200 stings per day.
Oh.
It wasn't too bad. I very much enjoyed listening to you because you all that you've described on there, I've done myself.
I tend not to take bees out after August.
No, I won't take them out after the middle of May.
But
because if you take them out between March and the middle of May, they'll build up and do good.
But there are some times when bees have to be removed.
Oh, absolutely.
When there's contractors on site and they're being stung by bees, you can't say, well, you have to wait till next year.
No, I've done a few at a time. We had the one of the electric substations near where my small holding is. The cow shed, there were 3 colonies. I went and had a look. They said, I can't go on the property because of the danger of electricity substation.
Yeah.
I looked over the gate and I could see 1 colony flying very strongly. A couple of days later, I had them out. But in fact, there were 3 colonies in different places. And out of the 3, 1 was exceptionally good, 1 was pretty poor. And the third one, as soon as I got it out and into the hive and onto its frames, it flew away.
Oh.
Anyway, nice to hear your talk. Thank you.
I've got a question from Roy T. He says, what is your success rate in chimneys? If you don't find the queen, what do you do?
If I don't find
do it all again.
The problem is we're taking bees out of places other than beehives. With a beehive, you have the opportunity to take out frame at a time and find out which one the queen is on. When they're in a building down a chimney, directly open that chimney up, then the queen will go to the darkest place. They don't like the daylight. So there is every possibility that you might not get the queen, especially if they're in a complicated place like a roof space where they can crawl up into behind the tiles. If I get a colony that hasn't got a queen in it, it goes into quarantine for a period of time, and I then unite it with one of my other colonies.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
Good afternoon. My name is Hans. I'm with Orpington Beekeepers. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I haven't heard the word payment mentioned. Do you actually charge?
I do. And each colony, each time I remove a colony, I assess the payment. So it's not a straightforward payment. Very often it will involve scaffolding. The scaffolding to the slide that you saw earlier on, that's £450. There's no way that a beekeeper is going to put scaffolding up and remove the bees for free.
No, fair enough. Now, the reason I ask is I also collect bees occasionally for Orpington Beekeepers. I've never charged. I don't think I ever would, but I can understand in your situation, seeing some of the impossible positions where you've been, I'm not surprised you charge.
If you take bees out of a building, swarms are different because they're relatively easy to capture. But once you're working in a building, if you spent all day working in a building getting bees out, it can't be done for free.
And done.
Thank you.
Yeah. Come on.
Hello, Mark.
Hi.
Hi, it's George and Lisa Jenkins. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Firstly, thank you. Fascinating. Thoroughly enjoyed that. We've done a few cutouts ourselves, but very amateur compared with some of the complex ones that you get involved in. And I certainly don't have a head for heights. So some of those that you've done are quite impressive. And again, we only tend to work up to the KBKA insurance height of the 10 foot.
Yeah.
But it's really enjoyable. It's another fascinating aspect of beekeeping. Might sound like a bit of a silly question, but how do you cope with the honey? Because we do tend to end up a bit of a sticky pair.
I often have 2 or 3 bee suits with me because especially the colony I took out of the bell tower.
Yeah.
I got absolutely covered in honey.
Right.
And as a consequence, you get covered in bees. The estate manager looked at me one day. I come down off the scaffold and I was covered in bees. And he used an expletive and mad after it. He said, "You must."
And the bee vac, you talk about a decompression chamber. We modified a polynuke with using the top and the bottom, a super on a polynuke, and that seemed to work well.
Yeah, you need something about the size of a nuke area for the bees to be decompressed in.
Yeah.
I converted a Wix vacuum cleaner, an aqua vac. I converted that and made my own box to put in line with a kitchen sieve to stop the bees being sucked into the motor.
Into the motor, yeah. We put some gauze across that slot, and it does seem to work well, as long as it's at a relatively low pressure. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I think in about 15 years of taking bees out of buildings, I think I've only used a bee vac maybe 2 or 3 times.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Most of the time, it's a matter of getting your hands into the nest.
Yeah.
Carefully taking them out. In actual fact, I'll probably get stung more by my own bees than bees in chimneys.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Okay.
What do you call those hands?
I believe David Ray has a question / comment if he's around.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thanks to Mark for sharing all your, some of your experiences. One little thought: we in the Sidcup Ruxley branch get involved in quite a number of building extractions and so on. And a couple of years ago, we had the great good fortune that a new member is an architect, and his firm had an extremely posh thermal imaging camera.
Oh.
And we first realized this because he started sharing pictures of his own bees. He was thermal imaging his own bee hives and exchanging tales about, look, they've all moved up the top, or look, they've all moved to the back, and the rest of it. But then he got involved with removing some bees from a bungalow where they got into the space between the ceiling and the loft. And of course, using the thermal imaging camera, he and his friends were able to identify exactly where in the bedroom the bee colony was in the ceiling, and they then cut out exactly the piece where the nest was. And one of his friends was taking pictures and videos, and it was really very impressive that they managed to cut the plaster precisely where the nest was, and so on. And just to finish this little ramble, we've subsequently persuaded him to borrow it from his employer over weekends when we've had jobs in buildings. And it's been really very useful on a couple of occasions where the bees are going in through a hole in the brickwork on the front of the building, and you don't know where the devil they've really gone to. And it's been very useful in pinpointing exactly where it's worth taking up the floorboards or taking off the tiling on the outside. So I just offer that as a small adjunct of high technology coming into our ancient traditions. Thank you.
Well, I can go back. Let's go low technology now, because if honeybees have made their nest in a stud wall or in a ceiling, in the roof space, if you rub your hand over the wall or the ceiling, bees generate an awful lot of heat, and you can actually detect where they are by doing that.
You've got your earphones on then?
Yeah, I've got my earphones on, yeah.
But you can still hear it.
Yeah. Hello, Mark.
Hi.
Derek Stevens. I'm Terry Clare's partner, one of Terry Clare's partners. Can I get in touch with you somehow?
Anytime.
I need your phone number.
Ah, right. Have you got a pen and pencil?
Yeah, I've got a pen.
07.
Hold on a sec. Right. Yep.
07.
Yeah.
02.
0707.
No.
Sorry.
07.
Yeah.
802.
802.
76.
Yep. 76. 21.
21.
2121.
Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you, Mark. I'll be in touch soon.
I enjoyed Terry's course when he did it many years ago.
I only done it 4 years ago. Mick Hare, in our other partner. There's two of us partners, and we enjoy it. We've taken over Terry's work on bees.
Yeah.
So I want to talk to you about everything.
Anytime.
Great. Thank you, Mark.
Okay.
Ray Copeland asked if you have any tips for bait hives.
I've never used them actually, so I don't know. I think there are two ways of looking at it. Some people say that the bait hive must be empty with just empty frames in it, or with a few frames that have got drawn comb on them. I think both methods work because bees do move into buildings where there is an old bee's nest in there and there is comb in there. They do move in and take over the comb. So that is a possibility.
Okay, and Susan Chartier, who may very well have already written your mobile number down, asked if you're available to pass on any bees in buildings calls this season.
To pass them on?
Yes.
One of the biggest difficulties with once I've taken bees out of buildings is that the comb goes into the frames and is held in with elastic bands. That comb has no reinforcement in it, so they are very, very fragile. And I usually don't, I would certainly not give them to a beginner beekeeper, because if the comb is turned over horizontal, the wax will fall out.
Yeah, sorry, I think a misunderstanding.
Yeah.
I believe she's trying to find out if she can pass on calls.
The calls for him to do.
For people who have contacted her.
Yeah, as long as we're COVID compliant, I'm not worried. I have actually just had my first jab, so it's going to be a couple of months.
All right. Thank you, Mark.
Well, I mean, if you want any advice, just give me a ring.
And I believe the last one is from, well, at least the last one I have here is Wendy Laffan, who has asked two questions. Have you removed bees from trees? And do you have any issues with colonies staying in their new hive once moved, or do you take measures to keep them there?
With the first one about trees, I've only taken one colony out of the trunk of a tree. It meant felling the tree, the top half of it first, and then the bottom section, using an axe to split the trunk down in half, and then just transfer them across comb by comb into a beehive. Whether I don't take any special precautions to keep the bees in the hive once I've got them to the quarantine area. The majority of the time, the bees will have the queen with them anyway, and also there will be brood comb, which keeps the bees at home. They wouldn't necessarily move out of the comb, move away from the comb.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions from anyone?
I've got one. What's your advice for, I would say, the more inexperienced of us that haven't done any sort of building cutouts to try and get a little bit more involved, get a bit more experience? I know from my perspective in Ashford's, our mentors are normally very busy during the summer season to be able to help more the inexperience of us, other than just going to those in people's gardens.
I think this is probably one case where you really need 2 or 3 of you, and don't take on anything that's too complicated. You've got to be able to work safely, and to work safely with the client that you're doing the work for.
Okay. Anybody else?
Just one little point. It's Christine here from Dartford Peas. Hi. On a practical note, when you take the comb out from the original place, do you immediately put it into the new holding hive, or do you sort of put it to one place in a box or something and then transfer it to the hive afterwards?
When I'm taking bees out of a building, I try and get all the brood comb into the hive. It's almost impossible to put the wild honeycomb in the frames and hold it in with elastic bands. It really is so fragile. So what I do then, when I get the hive back to the quarantine apiary, I put a crown board on top of the hive with the 2 holes in it, put an eek on top of that, and then put the honeycomb on top of the crown board and put the lid on, put the roof on.
Oh.
And the bees will go up through the holes and take the stores down into the brood box below.
Oh, right. Yeah, good plan. Thank you.
Well, you can't give the honeycomb to any other colony of bees because of the chance of infection or disease.
Mm.
And I think probably putting it on top of the brood box is the best method.
Yes, I can see that. Thank you.
Lovely. Okay. If there's nobody else. Doesn't.
Hi.
Oh.
Hi there.
Down the bottom got a hand up.
On New Year's Eve, I was as part of the Canterbury Beekeepers on the Facebook group. There was a notification about some bees that were spotted inside of a tree that had recently been cut down and sliced, as it shows on my virtual background.
Yeah.
Went out there and picked them up. I'm just going to change the background again so you can see what else has been going on, because I'm not sure how to actually put the pictures themselves up. And they were found to be inside of that very small cluster. When I got them out, there must have probably been enough to fill a large mug, I would have said, if you filled them completely. And so at the moment, they're all fine. They're inside a full-size box, but wedged in with insulation either side to make it down to a 5 frame. I've stolen a couple of frames of resources from my other hive, which is my first ever hive as well. And so I've gone from July to the 31st of December, from 0 hives to 2 hives. And that was quite interesting, cutting it out from the actual center of the tree that had already been sliced. But they're very, very cold, New Year's Eve bees. And so far, they've been out and done a couple of flights and things. I've seen a few bees going in and out of that particular hive and taking down fondant and stuff. So I'm quite happy with what's happened there. So hopefully that was my very first ever extraction. And it seems to have gone okay so far.
I noticed that the tree behind you is lying on its side.
It was a large, I can't remember what sort of tree it was, but it was up near the rugby club at Canterbury. It had already been cut down, and I think they'd abandoned the slices and ran away bravely.
Because if you were to cut the trunk,
it would have been a dreadful way to have done it. I mean, the better one would have been is, okay, there's the hole where they're going in, and obviously a couple of foot above and below, and have that section come down on its own. But
yes, yeah.
As it happens, they were already sliced and left on the ground. And so when I first, another background there is, I'll shift out the way.
All right.
We were extracting the bits and pieces and pushing them into a painted poly box. So it worked quite well. As I say, hopefully they'll make it through this next week or so with the freezing cold weather.
The cold is not a problem. It's damp weather,
humidity, yes,
and lack of stores.
Yeah,
and also lack of bees. I mean, there may not be enough bees to generate enough heat.
Yeah, I mean, there was pretty much that much on the comb that's there.
Do you know if there's a queen?
A little bit more.
You know,
she was seen. There was a queen seen, yes.
Just wrap them up, keep them warm, and feed them.
Yeah. yeah, I mean, they're still going, so fingers crossed. They've been fed fondant. They've been given a couple of frames of resources from another hive. Just keep my fingers crossed.
Yeah.
But yeah, just thought I'd share that one with people.
Brilliant.
Is that Bob Smith with his virtual hand up?
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Education and Show Committee, I'd like to thank our speakers very much for their contribution today. Very interesting, generated lots of interest, and thank you very much all of you for booking in and running this, especially to Steve, who I think he's still got the same amount of hair that he had the last time I saw him. But we're going to go through all this again.
Rapidly decreasing.
With a committee meeting. Just a couple of things. There is talk about there being a Kent show this year in July, the 9th, 10th and 11th of July. But that is subject to a meeting at the Kent Showgrounds next week or the week after, when it's anticipated they will make a decision as to whether it will go ahead or not. The original message that came out was that there probably would be a show, but different to what it has been in the past. So it may be that if there is a show, we will be looking for volunteers to help us out then. What else have we got? On that point, I didn't get the guy's name that spoke to Mark earlier on for his phone number, but I understood you to say that you'd taken over from Terry Clare, or taken Terry Clare's bees over.
He had.
Sorry?
He had, Bob, not me.
No, I know he has. That's what I'm saying. He spoke to you,
yeah,
and said that he had taken over Terry Clare's bees and what have you. So if we do have a Kent show this year, I would like to speak to him, because Terry supplied bees for the Kent show. So I need to speak to him. So I don't know who he was.
Bob,
yeah,
I'm still on. Derek Stevens, and I do belong to Medway Beekeepers.
Oh, right. So
okay,
yeah,
Derek Stevens. I'll talk to you later.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, Bob. Thank you.
So yeah, everybody, thank you very much. We hope that this is going to be the best season that we've ever had. We're the eternal optimists. There won't be any dangers or anything at all. You'll have loads of honey, and we'll see what happens. But once again, on behalf of the Education and Show Committee and everybody from that committee that's put the work in relation to putting this set of lectures together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, lots more silent clapping. It's always very nice to see. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you.
Watch the rugby now.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Go on, England.
Steve, before you go, why is it my picture's not come up on the screen? I know I'm an ugly man.
Oh, I don't know, Bob.
Is it people that are on YouTube?
Have you got a line through the stop video on the bottom left-hand corner?
Start video, yeah.
Have you got a line through it?
I did have, yeah. Oh, I'm there, right.
Oh, there he is.
Oh, right. So everybody can see how handsome I am.
That's not the Bob Smith I know.
Turn it off. Turn it off.
And Mark, the beard doesn't suit you, by the way.
It's not a beard, it's my hair's grown long.
Right. Okay, guys. Thanks a lot. Hello, Donna.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.